Real world versus hypothetical. It factor versus if factor. Justin Herbert versus Joe Burrow has been one of the biggest debates in the NFL community over the last almost 5 years at this point. Because of this, and because we have our top 10 quarterback ranking episode coming up, me and my two co-hosts have set out to try to answer the question of which quarterback would you rather have. To do this, we've each recorded our own individual arguments for who we think the better player is. We don't know what each other's going to say. We're just making the case the best we can for our guy. Let's get into it. I think the first thing that you have to address when you're talking about Herbert versus Burrow is the hypothetical question, right? Is it valid to take into account the weapons that Joe Burrow has and the lack of weapons that Justin Herbert has? Or do you have to take their statistical production and maybe their team success at face value? To me, I think it's pretty tough to ask anybody to ignore the fact that, yeah, Burrow does have better receivers, and at one point, I think was on a much better team overall. To me, as much as I like making fun of like the Herbert hypotheticals and calling them if man, you do have to take that stuff into account. It's undebatable that having several star wide receivers makes a difference to a quarterback. That's true for every QB in the history of the NFL. Think about Patrick Mahomes, for example. When he had Tyreek Hill and prime Travis Kelce, he was putting up 50 touchdowns in a year. When Travis Kelce was older and Tyreek Hill got traded, his production was a lot more pedestrian. And now, maybe with Xavier Worthy kind of breaking out towards the end of last year and Rashee Rice getting healthy, his receivers might be better, and I wouldn't be surprised if his production was again better. So yeah, I think it's absolutely valid to note that having Quinshon Judkins on the outside is different than having Ja'Marr Chase on the outside. That being said, I do think some people go too far and start to dock Joe Burrow because he has great receivers. Yeah, it's maybe a fair argument to say that if Herbert had T. Higgins and Ja'Marr Chase, he could be leading the league in receiving yards and receiving touchdowns. But when Joe Burrow does have those guys in real life, he does hit those numbers in real life. Whatever you think Herbert would be doing with great receivers, Joe Burrow probably already actually is. Now, the winning, particularly the playoff success, is a little bit more complicated. Burrow has found major playoff success without finding a Super Bowl ring, whereas Justin Herbert has appeared twice and didn't win either of his games. On some level, I don't think I can blame anybody for, when we get into top 5 quarterback talks, wanting to see some playoff production. But at the same time, I see guys like Lamar Jackson maybe not have the greatest resume in the playoffs yet. So it's not unheard of very good quarterbacks to not have a fantastic playoff resume. In fact, most people don't have fantastic playoff resumes. With Herbert, it being only 2 games means that it's a really small sample size to judge him on. And even then, if the Chargers hadn't fizzled entirely as a team against the Jaguars, we might be talking about this differently. It would be one thing if Herbert was getting into the playoffs and looking like a significantly worse quarterback, but honestly, I think he maybe just put together a couple of average games at the wrong time. And I kind of think this last year with how the Bengals were has really proven that point, that maybe playoff success, team success, not the best way to judge a QB. He just had his best season yet and didn't even see the playoffs because the defense was really bad. Burrow hypothetically could have had a bad defense when they went on that Super Bowl run, and maybe that would have cost them earlier in the playoffs, and he would have never made a Super Bowl. That wouldn't make him a worse player, but I feel like people would perceive him as a worse quarterback. All of this is to say, while it's easy to judge guys based off the results, and I'm not saying I never judge guys just based off of what the results are, I think it's probably best, if we're making a big long video about this, to try to judge the guys based off just who they are as players, divorced from what the supporting cast around them looks like. So the question is, what's the difference between these two dudes? I'll start with Herbert and what I think his strengths over Burrow are. Mainly, he has a much bigger arm. In fact, I think he has one of the biggest arms in all of the NFL. I'd probably put it at least top 5, if not top 3, and maybe outside of like Allen, I think you can make an argument that it's the best. And that arm strength really matters, not only with trying to throw it as far as you can, but fitting the ball into tight windows and accessing throws that most other quarterbacks can't. I know that might sound like something you hear on the scouting report of a draft prospect who hasn't proven it yet, but the thing about Herbert is that you say that about him, and then he actually does make those throws in big moments at the NFL level. He combines that arm power with great accuracy, great awareness in the pocket, and an ability to get through his reads very quickly, right? So it's very functional, and I think it's an aspect that's a lot stronger than Burrow's game. Burrow, on the other hand, I think is stronger in terms of his accuracy and his placement. I feel like his superpower coming out of college was the fact that on short and intermediate throws, he would put the ball exactly on the money where you want it to be. And that's good in terms of being able to get your guys to maximize the yards after catch because they don't have to make an adjustment to the ball. But on top of that, I think it also allows him to hit throws in a certain way that other guys maybe can't access all the time. So I think both of these guys can make super high-level throws, but sometimes they get to them in different ways. But if I had to pick one of these guys, I would go with Joe Burrow because I think he's just more aggressive out of the pocket than Justin Herbert is. Burrow, I feel like, has always been a guy who tries to make big plays all the time, whereas Herbert is maybe a little bit more confined to the pocket at times. You wouldn't expect that because Herbert is the bigger athlete, right? He's got 20 pounds on Burrow. I feel like he's a little bit more mobile. He's got the bigger arm. All of those signs would point to him being, the guy who's getting out and creating plays all the time. And he certainly can do that. But I think in reality, even though Burrow at times will be getting the ball out as quick as anybody, I mean, his average time to throw is lower than Herbert's. When it comes to keeping the ball for yourself, scrambling out and making a play, he's also doing that at a higher rate. Now, it used to be that the trade-off for this was that he would take more sacks, which isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. You're kind of a gambler, you're rolling the dice. Not necessarily good or bad, right? But this most recent year, that just wasn't the case. He wasn't taking sacks at a higher rate. He had a very comparable number of sacks to Justin Herbert. He had 48 to Herbert's 45, although remember, Burrow dropped back far more often. And his pressure to sack percentage was incredibly similar as well. Because of that, I'm going to give the edge to Burrow, who I think is just slightly more aggressive, even if he's not quite as toolsy as Herbert. But to be clear, I think both of these guys are top 5 in the NFL. I thought maybe earlier in this last season that Stafford could be up there and maybe Burrow was a little bit overrated. But after this season, I just can't get behind that take. They're close enough so where I think any given year you could probably look at it and say, well, maybe Herbert had the better season this time. And then the next year, okay, maybe Burrow had the better season this time. And I think if the Chargers rebuild continues to go the way it's going, which I feel like is pretty positive overall, then Herbert's supporting cast might improve and he might be able to statistically compete or just straight up compete in the AFC with Burrow as a whole. But for now, with how they played in the most recent season, I'm going with Joe Burrow.
There's only one good way to begin the defense of Justin Herbert, and that's by posing, of course, a ridiculous hypothetical question. What if Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Mike Gesicki were on the Chargers, and Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston, and Will Dissly were on the Bengals as part of some ridiculous trade? It's a move that would clearly never happen because the Bengals would never accept it. They're better at all 3 spots. Chase is the most expensive wideout in the league for a reason, and Higgins is 9th. Together, those two are making nearly $70 million per season. Every cent earned by making ridiculous catches, breaking tackles, and winning triple crowns. Elevating the offense, elevating Joe Burrow. In Los Angeles, McConkey seems destined to join the $30 million club, but Johnston is fighting the bust label. Free agency spoke and said Gesicki is worth double that of Will Dissly. Statistics, they give Burrow the edge in this debate, but that doesn't mean much when there's such a discrepancy in the supporting cast. Burrow doesn't have to cover up any weak links. Football media likes to pretend that quarterbacks are more valuable than they really are. Coaches know it's the ultimate team game. Every play the Bengals and Chargers run is designed for a skill position player to advance the rock. Receivers must create separation and catch the ball for the quarterback to accumulate any statistics. So, hypothetically, what would Herbert's numbers look like if he got to play with these Bengals guys? It's often said that you play zone to beat the quarterback and man to beat the receivers. And against man coverage is where Burrow put distance between himself and Herbert last season. T. Higgins caught 79% of his on-target passes versus man. Quentin Johnston caught just 46% of his on-target passes versus man. The EPA gap between the two players against man is 25 points. Between Gesicki and Disley, it's a 23-point gap. And I know this isn't just a Herbert problem because McConkey's numbers against man are fantastic. They're even better than Jamar Chase's. So I guess I can't answer my hypothetical. I don't know exactly what Herbert's numbers would be if he had Burrow's weapons or vice versa. But when you look at where the stats are coming from, it's obvious how Herbert's ceiling is capped by the limitations of the weapons in a way that Joe Burrow's isn't. Now, what about zone coverage when separation for the wide receivers is kind of a given and it's up to the quarterback to find the right window? I've got to say that I absolutely love to watch Burrow against zone coverage. He's got a scalpel, he's surgical, he reads the coverage contour of the Eagles' defense here and understands their tendency to play cover 4 with 4 guys in the deep zones, and if they're doing that, it means that one of these mugged up linebackers has to play the flat from a bit of an awkward angle. He knows what he's got pre-snap. He confirms it post-snap. Gesicki is going to push this corner kind of outside and vertical, opening up the hole for Chase. So Burrow, on his 3-step drop, takes 1 step and then quickens his next 2 to get the ball out as fast as possible. He begins that release before Chase is even turned around, and the ball is there so fast that there's extra space for Chase to work with after the catch, which he always takes advantage of. There's not a doubt in my mind that Joe Burrow is the best West Coast offense distributor we've got in the league today. Herbert may not operate with that kind of speed, but he has a lot more range to attack all areas of the field. On this play, for instance, the deep half player in space cheats a bit far inside because he thinks there's no way that Herbert can make the throw from the far hash to this sideline over the nickel and in front of him. But Herbert has the arm talent to do just that. Burrow does not. This ball would hang in the air too long, and it would be heavily contested or picked off. Take this play, for example. The ball is on the left hash. They're playing cover 2 to the right, and this corner route from T. Higgins goes pretty much completely undefended because that safety is cheating to the middle of the field. Burrow, he had a lot of time to find this throw, but he never really looked at it because those big corners to the field are just not really in his wheelhouse, and he takes a sack. The Browns tried to play it the same way versus Los Angeles, and of course, Herbert put him in the dirt. Herbert is much more explosive against zone coverage than Burrow is. This earned him a higher EPA against those looks despite fewer pass attempts and worse receivers. The big playability, regardless of who's around him, is why I would take Herbert over Burrow. And I predict Herbert's durability, baseline arm talent, and stationary play style will help his game age better than Burrow's for the future. The best case for Burrow, I think, is really one against Herbert, the lack of playoff success. But I'm not willing to take this sample size very seriously yet. The day Drew Brees turned 31 years old, he had 1 playoff win to his name. Steve Young was a big game choker until he wasn't. Peyton Manning began as the worst playoff performer of all time, pretty much, but eventually ended up with 2 rings. Give me Herbert and get him another elite weapon.
When I look at Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow, 2 QBs who came into the league at the same time, picked 5 spots apart in the 2020 NFL draft, it does kind of feel like we are having the same discussions now as we were then. If you were to build a team from scratch, which guy would you rather have? It is kind of the same thing as a draft, except now we have 5 years of data of these guys playing in the NFL to make our decision based on. But let's rewind for a second and focus on the foundation of these guys. Joe Burrow was the surefire number 1 overall pick in the 2020 draft, coming off a national championship run at LSU, a Heisman Trophy winner. This was widely considered to be one of the greatest college football seasons of all time. Justin Herbert, on the other hand, was considered to be more of a project and was taken 6th overall due to his size, athleticism, and arm talent, all of which was very Josh Allen-esque, but it became very clear very fast that Justin Herbert was not only not a project, but that he would probably be one of the best quarterbacks in football for quite a long time. The start to Joe Burrow's NFL career was not exactly the same, as his rookie season was cut short due to injury, but as soon as he came back in the 2021 season, the Bengals made their first Super Bowl in over 20 years, and Joe Burrow Burrow was awarded with Comeback Player of the Year. And let's talk about that playoff run, because I do believe it is the achievement that holds Joe Burrow in such high esteem for so many fans, when the reality is that it was more so Lou Anarumo's defense that got the Bengals to the Super Bowl than it was Joe Burrow's arm. And also, we are 3 years removed from this Super Bowl, and it still feels like Joe Burrow's getting credit for it, even possibly more so than Matt Stafford, who hit a game-winning touchdown and threw a no-look pass on the game-winning drive. But regardless, it's not like Justin Herbert has had some electric playoff career himself. In the 2024 season, he threw 4 interceptions in a playoff game against the Houston Texans. And then in the 2022 season, they were up 27-7 against the Jacksonville Jaguars and allowed them to come back and win 31-30. And Trevor Lawrence threw 4 interceptions in that game. But weirdly enough, it feels like the Jags game is the one that is held over Herbert's head more so than the Texans one, even though the Jags game, I feel like, is less Justin Herbert's fault. Just looking at the 2022 Chargers alone, Justin Herbert threw nearly 700 pass attempts, 4,700 yards, and yet not a single Chargers receiver had even 900 receiving yards, with the most catches going to Austin Eckler and the most yards to Mike Williams, who, mind you, was hurt in that Jaguars game. And this does bring me to my next point, which is probably the most discussed point in the Justin Herbert-Joe Burrow debate: the supporting cast. Because Joe Burrow not only has had, but probably will continue to have for his entire career, one of the best receiving duos in all of football, Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins. And not that it's his fault, not that I'm blaming him for it. In fact, it probably cancels out or helps balance the fact that he's had a terrible offensive line for most of his career, and in recent years, a truly terrible defense. But is that not also what Justin Herbert has kind of been dealing with over the past few years? A terrible defense up until the 2024 season, terrible receivers, a bad run game up until the 2024 season? The Chargers have been through 3 different offensive coordinators in 3 straight seasons. It feels like the only shining light in LA has been Justin Herbert and maybe their offensive line. But I think the reality that I'm trying to hammer home here is that neither of these guys have really accomplished anything. No MVPs, no Super Bowls, no All-Pro bids. They've both been dealing with very poor organization management, and neither of them has been able to overcome that. And even when you look at their career stats, Joe Burrow has a higher completion percentage, and it's actually currently the highest ever, so shout out there. But Justin Herbert has a substantially lower sack rate, Joe Burrow has a higher touchdown percentage, and Justin Herbert has a lower interception percentage. So neither guy really has the advantage, it feels like. It does make me feel like the only way to fairly judge who I would rather have on my team is just to pick the guy who I think could do more for my offense, even if only slightly. And so when I look at what Joe Burrow did to keep the Bengals in games, because he absolutely had to do it because their defense was so bad, it's no wonder he was in MVP conversations. And I think those would have been very legit had the Bengals made the playoffs. But I do think that when I watch Justin Herbert, he is just the more complete quarterback. His size, his mobility, his arm talent allow him to access all areas of the field, especially tight windows under constricting pockets. And when you look at his whole shot against cover 2, it's the best in the NFL. No one throws that ball better than him. He avoids negative plays at a really high rate, and I do believe that with the right group of guys, he would also create big-time plays at a rate just as high, if not higher, than Joe Burrow. Because Joe Burrow is often viewed as a guy who is just accurate and has good timing, and that's not true. There is definitely a level of creativity that separates him from someone like Tua and allows him to take advantage of his premier receiving threats. So at the end of the day, I do think it is really close. I think both of these guys are top 5, and I think it's neck and neck for that 4th spot. But I do prefer Justin Herbert over Joe Burrow.
That's all we've got for you guys today. If you stuck all the way through the video, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the dang bell. We're going to be coming out with the top 10 quarterbacks ranking podcast here probably pretty shortly, within I think a day of this going up. So again, if you want to check that out, you want to be reminded when it's posted, hit the bell, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'll catch y'all later.